Welcome back to Pretty Strange. Today we're talking about a place that has become one of the most infamous locations in American true crime and paranormal history. But before we get into the ghost stories, the investigations, or the legends that have surrounded this property, we need to start with the real story. Because this place didn't become known because people believed it was haunted. It became known because of what investigators actually discovered there, and because of the victims whose stories are still at the center of this case. Today, we're going back to the beginning, to the man who owned the property, the crimes that happened there, and how a real-life tragedy eventually became one of America's most talked about haunted locations. This is the story of Fox Hollow Farm. Before Fox Hollow Farm became a name associated with one of Indiana's most disturbing criminal cases, it was exactly what it appeared to be: a beautiful, sprawling estate in the quiet suburbs of Westfield, Indiana. The property sat on more than 18 acres of land and featured a large, impressive home, a pool, and landscaped grounds. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place most people would drive past and assume it belonged to a successful family living the American dream. And for a while, that's exactly the image that people saw. The owner's name was Herbert Richard Baumeister. To most people who knew him, Herb was a businessman, a husband, and a father. He owned a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot, stores that sold secondhand goods and clothes, not the nationwide grocery chain. Don't get confused. And he lived at Fox Hollow Farm with his wife Julie and their 3 kids. But behind that carefully maintained image was a much darker reality. Because when neighbors saw a successful businessman with a beautiful home, investigators would eventually connect Herb Baumeister to the disappearances of multiple men, many of whom vanished from the Indianapolis area during the 1980s and the early 90s. And the discovery that would eventually happen at Fox Hollow Farm would turn this quiet piece of Indiana property into the center of one of the largest criminal investigations in the state's history. For years, Fox Hollow Farm looked like the home of a successful family. But miles away from the quiet neighborhood, families across Indiana were dealing with a terrifying reality. Men were disappearing, and no one seemed to know why. Beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, several men began vanishing from the Indianapolis area. Many of them were part of the local gay community and were last seen leaving gay bars or socializing in spaces where they felt safe. At the time, that detail mattered in a painful way, because it meant some of these disappearances were not treated with the urgency they deserved. In an era when being openly gay still carried stigma, fear, and discrimination, families and investigators often faced an added layer of silence and dismissal. At the time, investigators were facing a difficult challenge. There was no obvious crime scene, no bodies, no clear suspect, just missing persons reports and families desperately searching for answers. Among the missing were men like Roger Allen, Stephen Hale, Richard Hamilton, and Jeffrey Jones. Each disappearance represented a person with a family, friends, and a life that suddenly came to a stop. And as more men disappeared, investigators began noticing similarities. Many of the missing men were young or middle-aged adults who seemed to vanish after socializing in Indianapolis. Some witnesses reported seeing them with the same man shortly before they disappeared. That man was Herb Baumeister. But connecting a person to a series of disappearances is one thing. Proving murder is another. For years, investigators struggled to build a case against Baumeister. He was a respected businessman, husband, and father. He had no obvious criminal history that would make him stand out as a suspect. And while investigators were looking into the disappearances, Herb continued living at Fox Hollow Farm, a place that, from the outside, still appeared completely ordinary, until one missing persons case finally brought investigators closer to the truth. The case against Herb Baumeister finally began to take shape. In 1993, a man named Richard Hamilton was reported missing after leaving a gay bar in Indianapolis. Like many of the other missing men, his disappearance initially seemed to have no clear explanation. But Hamilton's family continued pushing for answers. His sister became convinced that something more had happened. So she began looking into her brother's disappearance herself and discovered that his case shared similarities with other missing men in the area. Eventually, investigators began examining whether these disappearances could be connected. One of the names that kept coming up was Herb Baumeister. Witnesses reported that Baumeister had been seen with some of the missing men before they disappeared. Former employees and acquaintances also began sharing concern about his behavior, although investigators still lacked the evidence needed to make any arrest. Then, in 1994, investigators received information that would change the direction of the case. A man who had survived an encounter came forward. Under the pseudonym Tony Harris, this man told police that he had met Baumeister at a bar and had gone home with him. According to his account, Baumeister's behavior became disturbing, even attempting to strangle him, but he was able to escape. That testimony gave investigators something they had been missing, a possible connection between Baumeister and the disappearances. Police began looking more closely at Fox Hollow Farm, but there was one major problem. The property was private, and without enough evidence to search the home and the land, investigators had to wait. Meanwhile, Baumeister continued to deny any involvement. To his neighbors, he was still the same man they had always known, but behind the scenes, investigators were getting closer. And soon, the secrets hidden at Fox Hollow Farm would begin to come to light. By the summer of 1996, investigators had spent years trying to understand what had happened to the men who disappeared, but they were still missing the one thing that could turn suspicion into evidence: a solid reason to search Fox Hollow Farm. That changed when Herb Baumeister's personal life began to unravel. As investigators continued looking into the disappearances, Baumeister's wife Julie filed for divorce. Around the same time, investigators attempted to obtain a search warrant for the property, but the process proved to be complicated. Baumeister maintained his innocence and refused to allow police on the property. Eventually, though, investigators obtained a warrant to search Fox Hollow Farm, and what they found there would change the case forever. Beneath the surface of the beautiful estate were the signs that something terrible had happened there. Investigators discovered human remains scattered throughout the property, including areas of the woods and near the pool. Thousands of bone fragments were recovered, many of them badly damaged and difficult to identify. The discovery confirmed what investigators had feared. Fox Hollow Farm was not just connected to the missing persons reports. It was a crime scene. As forensic teams worked to identify the remains, the scale of what happened at the property began to become clearer. The remains were eventually linked to several of the men who had disappeared from the area. The victims included Roger Allen, Stephen Hale, Richard Hamilton, Jeffrey Jones, and others whose names have become permanently connected to Fox Hollow Farm. But even after the discovery, many questions remained. Investigators believed Baumeister was responsible for more deaths than they could officially prove. Because so many remains were destroyed or difficult to identify, the true number of victims may never be known. And before he could face trial, Herb Baumeister would never have to answer for what happened at Fox Hollow Farm. For the families of the men connected to Fox Hollow Farm, the discovery of human remains should have been the beginning of justice. Instead, it became the beginning of even more unanswered questions. Because Herb Baumeister would never stand trial for the crimes investigators believed he committed. After the search of Fox Hollow Farm began, Baumeister quickly became the focus of national attention. Investigators believed they had uncovered evidence connecting him to multiple disappearances, but they still needed to build a case strong enough to bring him to court. Baumeister maintained his innocence. He insisted that he had no involvement in the deaths and claimed that the investigation was based on false accusations. But as pressure continued to build, his life began falling apart. His marriage had ended, his businesses were struggling, and investigators continued closing in. In July of 1996, while police were still working to investigate the crimes, Baumeister fled to Canada. Shortly after, on July 3, 1996, Herb Baumeister died by suicide in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. He left behind a note denying responsibility and expressing his belief that he was being unfairly targeted. Weird behavior for someone who isn't guilty, but what do I know? His death meant that many questions surrounding Fox Hollow would never receive answers in the courtroom. How many people were killed? Was every victim identified? Were there other victims whose families never received closure? Those are the questions that remain. Investigators have officially connected Baumeister to multiple murders, but many believe the true number of victims is much higher. And because Baumeister died before trial, the full story of what happened at Fox Hollow has been left incomplete. But that didn't stop the story from continuing, because after the crime scene was gone and the investigation faded from headlines, Fox Hollow Farm became something else entirely. A place surrounded by rumors and a place surrounded by stories. After Herb Baumeister's death, Fox Hollow Farm was left with a complicated legacy. On one hand, it was the site of a documented criminal investigation, a place connected to missing men, human remains, and families who never got the answers they deserved. But on the other hand, something else was beginning to happen. The story of Fox Hollow started changing. As the years passed, the property became more than just a location connected to a crime. It became a symbol of something people couldn't stop trying to understand. How could something so horrifying happen in a place that looked so normal? How could a quiet Indiana neighborhood become connected to one of the state's most disturbing criminal cases? And what happens to a place after something so terrible happens there? Those questions are part of why Fox Hollow continued to attract attention long after the investigation ended. True crime enthusiasts became fascinated with the case. Authors and filmmakers revisited this story, and eventually, paranormal investigators began looking at Fox Hollow through a different lens. Because when a place carries that much history, people naturally start wondering if the events that happened there left some kind of mark behind. And that's when Fox Hollow began its transformation from a crime scene into a legend. As Fox Hollow Farm became more well-known, the story began attracting a completely different audience. Not investigators, not journalists, not true crime researchers, ghost hunters.
Oh my gosh, dude.
Over the years, people who visited or investigated Fox Hollow reported strange experiences they believed were connected to the property's dark history. Some described hearing unexplained noises inside the home. Others reported feeling like they were being watched, sensing a presence around the property or experiencing things they couldn't easily explain. For paranormal investigators, Fox Hollow was the kind of location that immediately drew attention. It had everything that often surrounds a famous haunted location: a beautiful old property, a tragic history, unanswered questions, and a story that people were already emotionally invested in. And as paranormal TV grew in popularity, Fox Hollow became part of that world. The property was featured in paranormal investigations, documentaries, and eventually became known outside of Indiana as one of America's most infamous haunted locations. For many people, their first introduction to Fox Hollow wasn't even through the criminal investigation. It was through a ghost hunting show. I'm talking about me. I am many people, and Ghost Adventures was the show. Given that I was basically in diapers when all this went down, I had no idea about any of this until I saw Zach and his team investigate, and later I fell deeper into the rabbit hole once I watched the Hulu docs about the murders. And that's part of what makes Fox Hollow such an interesting case. Two completely different stories exist side by side. One is a documented story of missing men, a criminal investigation, and families searching for answers. The other is a story of strange experiences, paranormal investigations, and a place that people believe may still hold on to the events that happened there. Whether you believe Fox Hollow is haunted or not, there is no denying that the property has become one of the most recognizable examples of how true crime and paranormal can collide. And once Fox Hollow entered that world, the story kept evolving. When a story becomes this famous, it rarely stays exactly the same. A criminal investigation becomes a news story becomes a documentary becomes something people discuss, debate, and retell, and with Fox Hollow Farm, every retelling added another layer to the story. The facts of the case remained the same. Men disappeared, investigators searched the property, human remains were discovered and Herb Baumeister died before he could face trial. But the way people talked about Fox Hollow continued to change. Some people focused on the victims and the investigation. Others became fascinated by the unanswered questions surrounding the case, and some became interested in the paranormal claims connected to the property. This fascination from all angles gave many different sides of the story a chance to emerge and different versions of the story to be told. Over the years, a number of people became closely associated with the Fox Hollow story. There's the current property owner, who's given his 2 cents on everything from the murder investigations to the paranormal, and even a few TikTok conspiracies here and there. Yeah, there's a whole corner of the internet that thinks the current owner, Rob Graves, yes, that's his name, is actually a very much alive Herb Baumeister hiding in plain sight. Search that one up on TikTok if you can't sleep sometime. Certain detectives and investigators have also become major figures because even after all these years, they're still pressing for answers and helping families get the closure they've been wishing for so long. There's even talk of another suspect that could be involved, and that's what the new documentary is about. But one man stands out in people's minds in particular, and I'd be doing a huge disservice if I didn't bring up one of the most interesting and controversial characters in this whole thing, Mark Goodyear. Although many people first heard his recounting of events under the name Tony Harris, Goodyear is the man who has become one of the most controversial figures connected to the Fox Hollow case. But before he became a subject of documentaries and online discussion, Goodyear was connected to the investigation itself. In 1994, Goodyear says he met Herb Baumeister at a gay bar in Indianapolis and later went back to his home. According to his account, what began as a consensual encounter became frightening when Baumeister allegedly attempted to strangle him. Goodyear says he was able to escape, and years later, his accounts became part of the investigation into Baumeister's crimes. For investigators, Goodyear's story was significant because it helped provide a possible connection between Baumeister and the pattern they were beginning to uncover. He was not just someone telling a spooky story about Fox Hollow, he was someone actually saying, "I was there." And that changed the way people viewed the case. But decades later, Goodyear's role in the story has become much more complicated. After years of staying mostly out of the public eye, he began sharing more about his experiences and his perspective on what happened at Fox Hollow. His appearances brought renewed attention to the case, but they also created new questions. Some people see Goodyear as an important survivor whose information helped investigators understand Herb. Others have become skeptical of some of his later statements and the way parts of the story have been presented and changed over time. If you haven't seen the Hulu doc, I highly recommend. The first part, The Fox Hollow Murders, Playground of a Serial Killer, is better than the second one, Return to Fox Hollow, New Victims, Darker Secrets, in my opinion. But it's worth the binge. At first, he was presented as a survivor that could give insight on what may have happened. Now people are wondering if he had more involvement, and his erratic behavior and interviews only raise more questions. But that's what makes Fox Hollow so fascinating. The original case already had tons of unanswered questions, but as the story continues being retold, things keep evolving. And hopefully that means more answers can be uncovered and more families can finally get closure. And that's it for this episode of Pretty Strange. Fox Hollow Farm is definitely one of those stories where the deeper you dig, the stranger it gets, which honestly is exactly why we're here. Thank you guys so much for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to leave a review, share it with a friend, and tell me what strange story I should cover next. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning everything. Bye!